does come out in a roundabout way. But yeah, I guarantee there's going to be extra pieces that just don't get released because they have to cover somebody.
And we've seen on this podcast where there's just certain people that if you put them in front of a microphone, they just start talking like, and they'll tell you their whole life story. And it's just whether it's true or not, it's like a huge amount of data that you're getting your hands on.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So another thing is, okay, so if you are called before a John Doe proceeding, if you are subpoenaed and you have to go in, you can bring a lawyer with you, but your lawyer doesn't do a whole lot of anything. All right.
Okay.
Like they can be there and they can like suggest whether you answer things or not. But again, ultimately, if the judge wants to, they can say, if you don't talk, we're going to give you immunity, and then you have to talk. So the lawyer may or may not help you in that situation. And the lawyer cannot cross-examine you.
Okay.
It's a one-sided thing. You go up on the stand, the district attorney has their list of questions, the judge listens in. You don't then get the opportunity to tell your side of a story. You only answer the one-sided questions.
Okay.
So, like, if you have an attorney with you and the attorney's like, wait, I have a list of questions that are going to put this whole thing in a different context, you can't do it. Not an option.
Interesting.
So, it's really weird. Yeah, ultimately, after this is all done, the proceeding wraps up, the judge goes over the evidence that's collected, and then we'll issue, charges based on that to different people. Now, what's interesting is apparently this traces back to the days before Wisconsin was a state.
Okay.
This traces back to like the 1830s. I could not find like any record of the discussion of how this law was created. And I tried. I really wanted to get to that piece. But there were references to it in Supreme Court cases after the fact. And apparently, it sounds weird because this sounds like the exact opposite of how we think of John Doe today.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason it's called John Doe, because people, I'm sure, are familiar with the term John Doe as in like when you don't know somebody's name.
Mm-hmm.
The reason it was called that is because it was supposed to protect people from frivolous lawsuits and frivolous criminal charges. So instead of you getting arrested or sued for something and then you're ultimately found not guilty, but your name's already out there and smeared and stuff, they thought this was a good way to protect you on that because they couldn't tell people publicly that you were a target.
Okay.
So this investigation would all happen, and then if you didn't get charged, nobody ever knew that you were being investigated.
But that's not what it's used for these days, right?
Well, it is, except for the fact that I think we pretty much can always figure out what the target is.
Mm.
So that's the thing.
But I mean, you can figure out what the target is as far as, what they're going after, but not necessarily who they're going. But I guess you could probably knock it down to like 3 people.
Sometimes you can figure out specifically who it is. But yeah, it's... So I read that, and I thought that was really weird. And like, I get it. And I think that made sense at the time. But it's weird now. And part of that is like the whole change in media as well. Because, we had newspapers going back before Wisconsin was a state. We've had newspapers before we were a state.
Mm-hmm.
But they weren't doing the kind of investigative journalism that they have done, that we're familiar with.
Right.
So they weren't like lingering around courthouses being like, ooh, who's going in to testify today? Like that wasn't a thing. So I think like once like media's kind of changed about how they investigate crime and corruption, the John Doe took on a different angle. And not necessarily even because the John Doe changed, but the fact that we became more aware that these were going on.
Mm-hmm.
So it suddenly like is this more like sinister thing. Like, oh, they're calling in all these guys. What's going on? Whereas before, you probably never knew they were doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, that's kind of interesting that the way that I think of, at least me, I can't speak for others, I guess, but the way I think of a John Doe probe changes based on the fact that the media approaches it different. But yeah, the Supreme Court in 1889 said, when the John Doe statute was first enacted, the common law practice was for the magistrate to issue the warrant on a complaint of mere suspicion, and he was protected in doing so. This was found to be a very unsafe practice. Many arrests were made on groundless suspicion when the accused were innocent of the crime and there was no testimony whatsoever against them. This statute was made to protect citizens from arrest and imprisonment on frivolous and groundless suspicion. So, according to the Supreme Court decision in 1889, if what they're saying is accurate, this was how it came about. But again, I can't find the discussion of like the legislators or whatever who like discussed it.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that that's really, I assume this is accurate. I don't know why the Supreme Court would make that up, but I couldn't find any record of the discussion of them creating the law, which I think would have been really helpful.
But okay, it seemed like the Supreme Court was talking about how this was an unfair tool. Did I misunderstand what you just read there?
No, they think it's a fair tool.
Okay.
No, they like it.
Okay, my bad.
Yeah, and even though like this goes back again all the way.
And now, is this the federal Supreme Court or Wisconsin?
Wisconsin Supreme Court.
Okay.
Wisconsin Supreme Court. Federal Supreme Court has not really touched it.
Okay.
More often than not, if it ever makes it that far, the Supreme Court's like, yeah, that's the Wisconsin thing. We don't care. That's your business. Yeah, so these things have been going on for the entire history of Wisconsin. When I did a newspaper archive search, I couldn't find a record of the words John Doe in reference to one of these probes before 1912. Again, they happened, but they just probably didn't make the news very much.
Or they just didn't call them John Doe.
Or they might not have publicly called them John Does, yeah. But starting around 1912, I found one. And from every point since then, they're pretty consistently, they turn up. You know, in our case, like I said, we've been seeing it for gambling. But I found some where there were like murder investigations and they didn't know who the murderer was, but they had suspicions. So they called in a variety of people to testify in secret to try to get more information on who had killed a specific person. So they've used these for a variety of reasons. So they do definitely have value.
When you look at it over time, do you see that they've gone down though, correct?
They're used less?
Yeah.
I think they're used less.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, I would say that again, this is just based on what's reported, so I couldn't give you exact numbers. But it does seem more like they kind of peaked in the 60s and 70s and then have gone down since.
I wonder why that would be. I wonder if it's just that since then technology has gotten so much better where they're just not necessary. But I mean,
I don't know.
It's so weird because, I mean, I don't know. What is your stand? Like, I feel like this concept, and especially since nobody else really that we know of uses these, this seems like a far-reaching overstep of our rights.
It definitely can feel that way, I think. Like other states have the grand jury process, which is a similar process, but I think the Wisconsin process goes beyond that. I think and I'm not familiar specifically with how different states do grand juries, but my understanding, which is limited, is that they're a lot more public and they're a lot more, they already kind of know what they're doing when they've reached that stage. Whereas the Wisconsin version does feel like a fishing expedition, at least when you're on the outside of it. I don't know, again, I don't know what happens inside, but from reading about them in the newspaper, it looks like sometimes they'll just be like, oh, this person might know something, let's call them in. And then they've got almost limitless power to get them to talk. Like, that seems really questionable.
It is, but then at the same time, if you ever sat in on one of these things, maybe you would find out that, they're only allowed to ask a specific amount of questions that are based specifically on one event, so they can't really totally fish for anything that they're